What a nightmare. Okay. And there's sufficient lag, which is also a bit of a nightmare, but I am having technical difficulties as usual when I stream. So, yeah. Sorry about this, everyone. I feel so... every single time this happens, I just am like beyond irritated. And there's... Here we go. Now I'm going to paste the link for this in my other stream. Ugh. I am pissed off. This is the second time this has happened, like with the live scheduling, and it's like the best idea ever. And for some reason, it's not. I'm having more difficulties. There we go. Okay, hi, everyone. Yeah, this happened with my International Women's Day event, I think, which was a pain in the butt, too. And it looks like I'm really behind. Looks like there's going to be some buffering. I'm going to connect my computer to an Ethernet cable, and then I'm going to, that might give me a bit more speed. I'm sorry, you're all so wonderful. We're going to have hopefully a good discussion today about this book once it gets started. I think this is just part of live stream culture at this point, is the inevitable irritating openings. Alas. Will my Ethernet reach? Yes, it will. Hell yeah. There, that should give me a bit better speed. How's everybody doing? It's interesting because with the software I'm using, I'm like in real time, but YouTube is just, it also could just be YouTube. I mean, fair enough. But I think we can expect a great deal of delay between yourselves and myself today, unfortunately. So, I don't know. I mean, the settings on YouTube have changed for live streaming. So I've just had to like refigure it all out. Like when Leah and I did live streams together, it was much simpler. I thought about doing this on my phone. That's not even possible. So like, anyway, now that I've sufficiently bored you all. Where are my notes? Okay. Right now my house is in disorder as well because of, I just have to like basically go through and like take stock of all of my possessions right now, and like it's a nightmare. But anyway, so everything's a bit of a mess. But in that, today we're going to talk about the book A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft. This is my copy. And this is going to be part of a series which I'm intending to do of, I don't know, I guess a live book club for all of us. In terms of my own life, as many of you know, I have been part of working with a feminist book group in my local community for a couple of years now. But that has shifted the last book we were reading was A Vindication of the Rights of Women before I decided to leave the group. And in terms of like organizing with others at this point, I think I'm pretty much not really interested in like that kind of work anymore. It's just been too stressful over the years and I don't have the space for it. But I like to read and I want to help facilitate women reading feminist literature how I can. And I think this is probably the best way. So let's start at the basics. I had wanted to read this book for years. The first time I saw it was actually at a conference, which I talked about in a video years ago about, I think, being electrocuted. That was the conference where I was electrocuted, and there was a really beautiful setup at this conference of like a bookstore, if you will, by I think the women who were from New York. They had brought a ton of like feminist literature to sell. And one of my comrades at the time bought a copy of A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and I looked at it and I was really interested in it, but I don't know, I just never ended up getting a copy or coming around to it. Although I think last year I bought a used copy at a Goodwill or something. So I really recommend thrift stores like Goodwill for literature. A lot of the time you will find a lot of classic stuff really cheap if you are thrifty and you want to have like a book collection of your own. Thrift stores are obviously really good. I found some of my best like stuff there, as opposed to like, I'm blessed because the city I live in has a pretty strong reading culture. So you find a lot, and there's a lot of bookstores around. But, you know, that's something I recommend. Anyway, this book has been really interesting to read at this point in my life. The subject matter entails kind of the Mary Wollstonecraft's perception of what is wrong with the state of womankind and also of humanity to a greater extent, and how the oppression of women has played into the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It has played into the degradation of society at large, because obviously women, the way she examines, I guess, the situation of womankind is very critical. And it's also a book that's a couple hundred years old at this point. So it was published, I think, first in, I want to say 1792, but that might not be right. Yeah, 1792 was when it was originally published. So the book takes on a lot of characteristics of the Age of Reason and Enlightenment. So she uses these kind of philosophical understandings to make her point, which is a very serious one, about how specifically the education, for one, of women and just the expectations placed on women by keeping women protected, which is often how men have often used the language of protection. And I still get this on my channel constantly, of men pretending chivalry about the situation with women, as if the fact that some of us, like myself, are engaged in feminist politics to whatever extent we are are missing the point, because men protect us and they build houses and they provide a society for us, and we should just be so thankful. But the fact is that men have taken on so much of this responsibility in the culture. It has come at the cost of women's minds, of women's integrity, she uses the idea of virtue specifically. And I've just glanced at the chat, and I'm so thankful that everyone is sharing kind of where they get books from. A lot of the times people are always like shocked about like my collection. My collection is much smaller than it was prior to my Saturn return. But I definitely think it's worth investing in used books, scoop them up and create a library, because especially like when it comes to political philosophy, the stuff and historical pieces as well, it's really important to have them in your collection and available for people who need them. I found the language difficult as well. I just want to respond before I go on. Yeah, I mean, I found it difficult, and English is pretty much my first language. So it's a difficult read. I think that too was part of why I wanted to do it. I wanted to share something challenging, None of your business, Ramblings of a Changing World. So anyway, I also wanted to go kind of back to the basics of what I see as the US society specifically, because I feel very strongly that we have to look at the foundations of our culture and where we came from to understand the trajectory we are on, and what women have been rebelling against for hundreds of years now at this point. Where kind of were these seeds planted? Mary Wollstonecraft is also an interesting figure to me. The fact that she is the mother of Mary Shelley, who is famous for writing Frankenstein, is interesting. So I wanted to read the book for these reasons as well. I have, at various parts of my life, been drawn into kind of a lot of intrigue and interest in the period known as Romanticism in English literature. So, yeah, I think of her as kind of like, it's interesting that I guess reading this book, it gave me more perspective on that as well, which I thought it might, but definitely did. Okay, so let's talk about some of the concepts in this book. I think I've belabored what I think of it. Was there anything else? I wanted to talk a little bit too. So I did mention that this is like from the Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, and also it was written soon after the French and American revolutions. So it was in this time of great social change and examination of classes, and a lot of people were looking at organizing society in a completely different way. And also organizing society built on virtue. This was also the time that the bourgeoisie wrested power from the monarch classes in many places around the Western world. So the class dynamics of society were shifting. The beginnings of industrialization were happening. So in this time, like that was the kind of birth of our modern society, if you will. There's a lot wrong with this culture. And there's a lot wrong with this society. And I think it's important to look at the intentions of a lot of the people who were influencing thought around these different times and what was happening. And I could spin all around about some of the concepts that came out in this book that were really enlightening to me. Specifically, her writing about virtue was really humbling for me to read. Virtue is something that I think women either have been denied and through just needing to survive as a second-class citizen in most respects, to, something that once women become adults with responsibilities, it can be very hard to learn. And she really deals with how our abilities as women to cultivate virtue are really, really damaged in our developmental stages in childhood. And this still, I think, rings very true. The reality is that most girls learn that it is better to be pleasing than it is to be virtuous. And she makes it very clear that those who are most pleasing are not necessarily those who are most virtuous, amongst all people, men and women. But also she makes very clear this idea that virtue cannot be attached necessarily to others. It's something that is self-cultivated, and it relates to our feelings, I think, about ourselves. Which I think is something that we should think about in this era of like virtue signaling, right? And how we respond collectively to issues that come up. What is the collective response? Generally, it's to attach oneself to virtues in the public eye. And this isn't new, but the extent with which everyone can participate in the public via social media right now is definitely exacerbating this phenomena. So I don't know, the whole concept of virtue really just hit me. It hit me in terms of my own personal life and choices and kind of looking honestly, because I think, I've obviously taken a lot of stands publicly that aren't popular. And I've done that not because I've done that because it's what was most authentic to me. But I still have been caught in like traps in my life of, not being virtuous always. I think this is common amongst anyone who's had to like please others to survive. You learn it in childhood. I need to check the stream. Hold up. God. For those of us who have learned how to be pleasing in childhood, for me, this was like, a cycle I was in, and still have been in. Hopefully I have learned the tools now that I can get out of these cycles, because obviously it's not completely conscious to us. When you learn these things in youth, they will affect you until you're an adult and you learn to intervene and step in for yourself. So yeah, I found the idea of virtue something that I needed to sit with, and I needed to like think about in my own life, how I am being in the world, Is this always, am I always virtuous? Am I a victim of circumstance and others, these kind of things? What am I responsible for? These sorts of questions. So personally, I found this book like what I needed to read at this time. So the concept of virtue, she dissects and looks at honestly women through being taught to please others, fall short of being virtuous, and then in adulthood it manifests as vanity. It manifests as being susceptible to flattery. It manifests as being an enabler a lot of the times, falling short of reason as well. Abandoning reason is another way that this can manifest. And in the book, she takes to task some of the male writers of the day, like Rousseau, who I have not read. And from her dissections, I'm really not interested in reading, honestly. I think it's important when reading men to always look at what they had to say about women. What was their perspective on women? And if it sucked, fuck them. So, yeah, the concept of virtue, big. The concept of modesty in women as well, and what modesty actually looks like. And she also takes to task this idea of modesty being a double standard. She really dissects a lot of the cultural double standards that women still survive, that still survive amongst women today. For example, the fact that a woman's chastity is attached to her virtue, and that once a woman loses like her respectability, meaning like, let's say a young woman is promiscuous, whatever that means, right? Because that's a loaded term in and of itself, and many people who are defined as promiscuous aren't, specifically women. But a woman develops a reputation for herself as being sexually active and available. Once a woman has earned that reputation, it is very hard to detach oneself from it, even if you have completely changed your course in action. And for men, they are forgiven much more for their faults, publicly speaking. Men, when they fuck up, generally are given a lot more second chances. When, the character assassinations against men do not cut as deep as they do against women. The level with which men are allowed to be human and allowed to change and develop and to grow into virtue, women are not given as many chances. Once you're canceled, you're canceled. I guess that's how it manifests now. These things, these beliefs and these habits that humanity is in, they're still very clear. Oh, one thing I want to say too, before I go on, I'm wearing this shirt, which is about fibrous dysplasia. And on the back, I don't know if you can see it. I'll turn around a little bit. For my dear friend Amberlyn, who has unfortunately had to suffer from this. So I think, I guess in terms of like, I was like really negatively impacted when Magdalene Burns died. It did emotionally affect me more than I suspected it would. And I think it's important that we support women who are alive and fighting, horrible fucking shit, and oftentimes it's lesbians who are facing like these challenges because oppression compounds the stress that one has from like living a life of being different all the time can really negatively impact one's health and can cause problems to exacerbate. And also like just the level to with which we're all very vulnerable to disease, Magdalene has died. And, I have other friends like Amber who are facing similar like challenges and have had to go through like horrible treatments. And it's just like, let's celebrate and appreciate women while they're here. So anyway, I wanted to wear it to give her a shout out because she's awesome. We used to work together and we've stayed in contact. And I have to say too, like in terms of like all of the relationships I've had, in terms of like support, it's amazing how much support I've had from my fellow workers. More than anything else, but like people who I've like had to work with. You're just thrown into these situations with strangers and they become some of the most important people in your lives. They really do. And I think that extends to the fact that like our class interests, and the fact that we have common enemies is so important. Anyway, so back to the book. Anyway, shout out and get one of these shirts. I don't know if they're still available, but they're pretty cool. I think she designed these as well. So yeah, I talked about modesty, virtue. Let me look at this. Reputation. Reputation is another one. What a woman's reputation is. She talks about how important it is that women guard their reputations above anything else. So slander, specifically when employed against women, is a lot more damaging than when employed against men, specifically because men have a really different culture in terms of how they relate amongst one another. Men don't expect their peers to be their friends. That's a really big thing that women need to like break down, culturally speaking. Like, your peers aren't necessarily your friends. And your peers, there's just, men have a completely different way of relating that way. Women are often in competition with our peers, or trained to be. So this weapon of like reputation, definitely I've seen over the years, keeps women locked in supporting specifically male power. I saw this very acutely when I was younger and dealing with like all the YouTube drama that came about from like the videos I was doing and also to the way I was interacting with the public. Like, I definitely, I know I wasn't anticipating the responses I got, and I definitely wasn't prepared to deal with them at the time. So, in terms of my own interactions at that time, I definitely fanned the flames of anger against me. But I noticed too at that time, like how disappointing a lot of women could be, because I think I've spoken to, like I had several women who were bigger YouTubers than me, privately writing to me about how much they liked my videos, how much they agreed with me, and then publicly would just like stab me in the back. And it's for the goodness of their reputations. Either that or maybe they were trying to get personal info on me, but not always. Often not. Often not. Often they were just like, oh, wow, I've really thought about this now. But in terms of being associated with me or any of my ideas, they wanted to distance themselves as much as possible to guard their reputations. Because YouTube, still to this day, in terms of like any sense of community, thankfully, due to capitalism, the notion of community amongst YouTubers is far less than it once was. But still, it exists today. And, in terms of YouTubers who try to cultivate community, you see amongst men like the same kind of cycles repeating, where to be a woman in these circles is you're very precarious, and you stay on top by basically aligning yourself with pleasing men and having a reputation in that manner. So a woman's reputation can impact her amongst men, obviously, but specifically women will as well weaponize a woman's reputation. So like that, threatening that is like a way to pull a woman back into line. Because, a reputation of a woman once destroyed is very hard to maintain again. I read something in the comments section about Louis C.K. and how he's being re-embraced. I think another thing about reputation, which is interesting, is the level with which like someone like the former president of the United States, George Bush, has been, both of them, mind you, has been rehabilitated to be somewhat like culturally acceptable, despite the fact that like a lot of the, I see a lot of people going on about, for example, like him being a war criminal. And yes, that is true. He also committed crimes against all of us in the United States, specifically by enacting and utilizing a tragedy to strip United States citizens of a lot of our freedoms. We live in a completely different world now because of what that man did. Obviously, the extent with which United States citizens have suffered has been far less than people around the world in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and the crimes that were committed there are atrocious. I'm not trying to diminish them at all, but the level to with which people can't be personally pissed about him is like really incredible. But he has been rehabilitated. He's a fun guy. So gross. So gross. Was Thatcher ever rehabilitated in this way? I will say this about that evil woman, though. She never faltered in her reputation, for better or worse, which is, something. Yes, this is something. I think that this issue happens as much in person as it does online. Just to respond to Kitty Cat, in terms of my own experiences with women's groups. And yeah, I find that I just don't deal well. I just don't deal well with women's groups. I don't. It's better if I just do my thing and let it be that, because I really have difficulties. So let's get back into the book. So yeah, modesty, reputation, virtue. These ideas I found really interesting. Some of the other ideas that I found interesting were her ideas about the education of children and the raising of children, which obviously is not something I have any intention of engaging in. But I do think that a lot of her observations were very true, particularly around how the lack of virtue in women, if allowed to grow and into adulthood without, developing, really causes them to be completely absent as mothers. And, I just look around, in terms of people I've known and what's, how specifically look at women I know who are mothers and some of the choices they've made. And while some have done everything they can, a lot of women, because they are not adults themselves and haven't developed the virtue for themselves and to themselves, integrity of their being, cannot really be there for their children. And, this is not said to blame at all, because obviously this is something that's done to us. But it is something that needs to be culturally repaired. Actual effort needs to be made to recognize this and to intervene, because I just think it's really sad to see. It's sad to see that mothers who are absent because of their lack of ability to be available fully. She makes the argument, what I want to get into this with her, the argument she makes is basically that if you haven't been able to develop who you are as a person, you're not going to be available to the actual responsibility of helping somebody else figure that out as well. She also talks about the education system. She makes the demand for children not to be sent away to boarding schools, that they should be educated close to home. Another thing she recommends is that all classes be educated together, and that the sexes be educated together as well. For at the time, most girls weren't educated, or if they were educated to a far less extent for a far lesser role than obviously their male counterparts, and thus were never really able to exercise their faculties. So she talks about this in terms of education, and she thinks that if the sexes are mixed in education, that it will benefit them. She also makes this, I've also read this in the works of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who also called for this. Sex integrated education. And I don't know what I think about it exactly. I received this mixed sex education. And I think that, most students in the US do. Receiving a single sex education is rare. And even now with most of the women's colleges, this is completely, it's very hard to get a single sex education. And I think it can be, depending on the circumstance, I think that it could be good for women to be educated separate from males. But the problem is that the resources tend to not be as good. And if you're dealing with an institution, let's say the US government, it's the same reason why schools were integrated with the races, or why it was such a big issue with having Black and white children educated together. It wasn't so much that it's wrong, right? Well, it is wrong to separate the races. Let me rephrase that. I do think it's wrong. it was more the fact that if you have these classes of people separate, then they will, by virtue of what's available to them, one being highly privileged over the other, that those who are disadvantaged, like let's say blacks, prior to Brown versus the Board of Education in the U.S., in the South specifically, and were not able to receive anywhere near the same resources for their educations, and get anywhere near the quality that white children were getting, even if they lived in like similar areas. So it was like about, and I think with Mary Wollstonecraft is trying to, through this integration process of education, destroy the class difference between males and females. So I have mixed feelings about it. I do. Like, I think in terms of like, if you are setting up a government, like trying to minimize class distinctions amongst the youth is so important. She also calls for uniforms of a similar stripe. Yes, this is the thing. I think what happens now, because single-sex education facilities, like I've had a couple respond to this idea, the issue is that now if you are going to a private single-sex school, I mean, you're getting a private education, period. So it's going to be tailored to the needs of a higher, social class. People who have more money and can send their kids to a school, pay to send their kids to a school. Like, so immediately you're going to be getting a better education. And also there is the level to with which, as Carol Simpson points out, that girls start to play dumb in front of boys, which is about, again, which is not virtuous, but it's about being pleasing. Anyway, I wanted to bring this subject up because I wanted to see what other people have to say about it. I have mixed feelings. I think it's one of those things where like many things are true and you have to like discern, when you're in the situation, what's best. Obviously, I'm not tasked with the burdens of raising any children, so not my circus, not my monkeys. Okay, so the education thing, what was the other thing I wanted to draw on here? Let me flip through the book and look at my notes. Oh, yes, the level to with which girls are physically held back, physically kept back, and the level to with which fragility is cultivated in girlhood, where girls are taught not to use their bodies to their full extent in order to be ladylike. She makes it very clear that this is a terrible idea, and it obviously will, if your body is not functioning optimally as a vessel, if you're sickly, if you are not able to like actually use, this is the thing. She makes the argument that we are imbued, like, and she calls on like all this Christian bullshit. There's quite a few things in the book that I don't like, and I may talk about them. Well, I probably will. She deals with this idea that like women have a soul, right? So we have this essence within us, which, means that we are like created in the image of God. I'm using her ideas here, all right? Her ideas. Is it correct then to hold beings like this back? Is it the correct thing to do to not develop them to their full capacities? no, it's not. If we have a body, right? I mean, she's using reason, right? With, she's trying to use reason and logic in terms of like a society, which is obviously pretends to be reasonable and logical. So we can get into all of that. But if these things are true, then it would make sense that in order to cultivate virtue for society itself, that all the members be able to develop themselves fully, physically and mentally and spiritually as well. And she talks about the level to with which women, cannot do things for themselves, physically or mentally. And she also talks about the level to with which, because of this, women are unable to fit their role in society, even, or their supposed role, right? Which she's talking specifically about motherhood and the duties of our sex, all that shit, right? Which, still is a really big issue for our sex. So she deals with this, if you don't have a functioning body that's healthy, your pregnancies are going to be terrible. The likelihood that you aren't even going to be alive to help take care of your children is very high. You might not be able to feed your children, i.e. breastfeed them. Like, she goes into all of this really real stuff, and, unable to like really develop virtue as, a mother creating another life form. Like, you're not able to actually be there for them, let alone fulfill the duties of and responsibilities of a home for them and for your husband or whatever, blah, right? So she's using this kind of reason to kind of advocate for more equality between the sexes. I want to say too, just stepping back, I know somebody said something about uniforms. I definitely think that uniforms are a good idea. And I vacillated from this. As a child, I didn't want to be in uniform, but as I've become an adult and I've seen the level to with which inequality plagues children and develops, it just crushes self-esteem, I think they're a good idea. I do think that skirts are definitely a no, though. I would agree with that. I think girls and boys should have uniforms that allow good movement, but also provide a sense of dignity and decorum as well. So that's what I think. Put me in charge of society. That won't be a total disaster. What else did I want to draw on? So yes, I've talked about the physical, mental, and just the levels with which women being trained to give up responsibility consistently, end up not providing anything for society and being really flippant. And she goes and describes many different women that she's known. She's highly critical of women as well. I think that's interesting to know, and how they've been formed into these grotesque creatures who are not available to the tasks at hand. She describes women who, are just, even though they're wives and mothers and they're in society, they just completely have no responsibilities and aren't responsible to anyone, and leave their children to their servants, which inculcate these children with entitlement issues, this kind of stuff. So she's dealing with examining this kind of, and speaking out against a lot of negative habits of society people at the time, meaning class privileged people. So I found that all interesting. Trying to think what she also speaks against, one moment she spoke against astrologers and cunning people and mesmerists, which I was just kind of I had a moment of oh wow about that, because that is stuff that I'm interested in. But I think too, she was also speaking about the hypocrisy and like the spiritual like inconsistency of women a lot of the time, where they'll like play with the devil, while going to church every Sunday. She spoke out against this, and the fact that idleness in women, means that they often engage in intrigue, and they engage in like creating scenarios of drama to intrigue themselves. She also talked about novels as being like something that like, women are taught to like value, what we're taught to value in terms of like self-development. She talked about how the kind of reasoning and education that girls get in terms of like what they're expected to consume, like what is acceptable for them to do as activities. Like in terms of reading, she talks about novels. And she says that it should be more important that girls be studying like history, which I agree, which is why we're studying this. So she talks about like how that can like turn the female mind into sentiment. She speaks out against sentimentality that women often have, and how what we should be allowed to cultivate is reason. So I found that like really, I agreed with that. I think I read one sentence in the book that actually talked about slavery at all, which was that was, I don't know, I thought that was unfortunate at one point. I don't know how much involvement she would have had in that, but it's interesting too to know. I mean, she speaks of it as like a bad thing, but of course no like actual respect is kind of given to the fact that like there are women who were enslaved and were involved in African slavery specifically, who were enslaved, and the fact that a lot of their struggles as women were just what they were subjected to was insane, in terms of the level of abuse and violence on top of like all of the other expectations of womanhood, which is also part of the reason why I think like, I guess I want to get into this too a little bit, like the level to with which white Western culture has not included Black women in its definition of womanhood. Like that's kind of what it made me think of, That being said, I don't like think one shouldn't read this book. I think one should, and then one should kind of think about what else was happening at the time historically. Like a lot of things were happening, a lot of things. This was a revolutionary time period, but not for everyone. It was also a time of like great murder and like exploitation of a lot of people. So I think that should be taken into consideration as well. Like, what society is she from, and like what, interestingly enough, like what is it built upon? What was its economy built upon? The other thing too, in terms of like boarding schools and this sort of thing, a lot of the time, like many people worked for the British Empire. So they were employed in places around the world, stealing other people's land and resources. So, the extent to with which I think the reasons why their society was set up the way it was, and the society today is set up the way it is, aren't really being looked at in the book. So these are some of my criticisms. I also didn't like how she wrote about prostitutes, I think, in the book. There was like a couple paragraphs that I was uncomfortable to read because of, I mean, I think she had sympathy in terms of who she was writing about, but still it's the case of like, you know, don't talk about us, talk to us, that kind of like perspective, which I think a lot of, women have had to deal with in terms of being used as like props in whatever white feminist, if you will, game is going on. And I use that term very broadly. What I really mean by that is like liberal, class privileged, white feminist. I think that can't be, I think liberalism and class privilege also have to come into that because they really all tie together. I mean, that's who she was. And I think she has a critical eye of those people. But anyway, what else? I don't know. She calls upon like us to understand our nature and our duties. And I think it's a thought-provoking book in that sense. And I think a lot of her ideas are very good and valid. And I think overall, I would recommend it. I definitely would recommend it. I'm interested in if anyone else has anything they want to talk about within the book, because it's about 2:21. I don't want to be on here for too much longer. I've already been on here longer than I anticipated, but of course, technical difficulties were what they are. So does anyone else have anything to add about this book? I will wait because there is a lag. Yes, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. They are what they are. I blame Google completely. Talk to us, not about us, right? That was something that I think that was first, or nothing about us without us was first coined by the disability rights movement. And then it was like, then kind of used by like women involved in different forms of prostitution as well. I can't remember exactly, but she like, if I can flip through and find it, I'll read it to you. I'm really not someone who likes to take highlighters or anything to my books. I like to not do that. So sometimes I lose things. So here she is writing about some writers. Okay. The shameless behavior of the prostitutes who infest the streets of this metropolis, raising alternate emotions of pity and disgust, may serve to illustrate this remark. They trample on virgin bashfulness with a sort of bravado, and glorying in their shame, become more audaciously lewd than men, however depraved, to whom this sexual quality has not been gratuitously granted, ever appear to be. But these poor, ignorant wretches never had any modesty to lose. When they consign themselves to infamy, for modesty is a virtue, not a quality. No, they were only bashful, shamefaced innocents, and losing their innocence, their shamefacedness was rudely brushed off. A virtue would have left some vestiges in the mind, had it been sacrificed to passion to make us respect the grand ruin. Ooh. If you understand like how most women end up in prostitution, that is very unkind. So there's a level to with which men are not being blamed for their actions against innocent young girls. And that, women who are employed as prostitutes are like, blamed for it. It's not. Yeah, it's rough, and it's there's like a level to her criticism is very great, but I think that's I think in terms of like dealing with that subject matter, a level of compassion is necessary when speaking to and about women who have worked as prostitutes or whatever in the sex industry. It's just like, if you really have an understanding of it, like it's just. Yeah, so I mean, her work isn't kind. We'll say that. It isn't kind, and I think like some issues could have been dealt with a lot more reason, No, I didn't feel like when she was criticizing like even like these contemptuous society women who cared more for their like lap dogs than their own children, like like she didn't blame them. She blamed their upbringing and their experiences. Like, so, I mean, and I guess you could say she doesn't blame them, but the way she writes about them is just like, whatever, like they're doing what they're doing to make money. So whatever. Okay. So moving on. We've had a good discussion about this book. We will be discussing next time this book, Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. This book was recently gifted to me by a friend who I've recently made. And one reason I want to read this book because I haven't read anything by Alice Walker, for one, and I would like to. And it seems like actually something that would provoke a good conversation publicly. So, and I think it has a lot of knowledge in it that would be helpful for public education. So next up, we will be reading In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, or discussing it if you've read it before. And that will probably be early December. I don't know what to do in terms of like announcing it exactly because like I've been announcing these live streams. So like that is frustrating because like I set this thing up and it never seems to work properly. So I'll probably do an announcement in this next week what day I plan to do this on and what time. I'll do it in my community announcement on YouTube, so it should pop up in your feed if you're like using YouTube properly. If not, I will also announce it on Twitter and Facebook and probably Instagram. And that, yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. Yeah. But yeah, early December, not early December, sorry. Yeah, early December. November is going to be a busy month for me. The next 2 months are going to be pretty busy for me. So in order to like make sure that, I read through this book, although I don't think it's going to be too difficult to read through just from like glancing through it. I think it's going to be a pretty easy read to get lost in. I think best to do it early December. And in terms of other announcements, I guess I have a new like shop online if you want to get merchandise. I've kind of shared that around. It's Society 6 Strange World. I've been putting some of my art and designs on there. I will continue to, so stay updated there. Apart from that, I don't really have anything to add. But yeah, that will be the next live stream, I guess, where we discuss a book. I am planning to do this for the foreseeable future. So if you like want to read along, please do. Or if you just want to listen to me talk about books, please do. I think it's a good thing to do, and I think promote literacy. I'm going to read one comment too before I go. Carol Simpson wrote, "We all have blind spots. Maybe she felt it necessary to emphasize her difference from this class of women. Perhaps her independence of thinking made a lot of men come on to her or try to buy her." Perhaps. I mean, I also think, there's a level with which it is important to look at and analyze people where you're at. I think a lot of the times people are really invested in trying to change, quote unquote, others instead of like their own kind of personal environment. And that's a problem. So, but whatever. It's these are just things to think about, really. I think, like I said, this is a book that really gets you to look at multiple truths at the same time and to come to some sort of have to come to some conclusions for yourself about how you are going to move forward with it. Because really it's about you and what you feel strongly about. So like in terms of cultivating virtue, like, are you able to live with yourself? Are you able to develop, are you putting yourself in the best place to move forward? Are you taking care of your responsibilities? That's what it's about cultivating. So yeah, thank you all for coming and watching. Thank you for those watching on catch up. I hope the buffering isn't too ridiculous. I don't know, things are what they are. Anyway, have a good day. I will see you again. Bye.